Okay, the moment has arrived, which it looks like many of you have been waiting for. We are here for a panel, or actually a fireside chat, with Vitalik and Gavin, and it will be moderated by Joe Schweitzer. So please all join us up on stage, and we will talk ideas and implementations.
Test.
Test.
It works.
It works.
All right.
All right.
So, we're copying. You guys rarely get together for something like this. And when we do, all too often, we can spend the entire time talking about history lessons and old stories. But while it has been 10 years since the Ethereum build was ongoing, I thought it might be fun if we just skipped it and talked about something that was more fun and more presently relevant. So I have a number of interconnected topics today based on many of your different ideas and implementations over time that have led us to where we are, and thought that we might discuss them and see where they take us from here. There are 5 sections that I'll run through pretty briefly. I'll start with one question to each of you that are different. Thereafter, all the questions are shared, so you can bounce off of one another. My first question is to Gav. You've authored the Ethereum Yellow Paper, Group Parity, which helped to prove out the multi-client ecosystem, and Polkadot championed what looked a lot like the roll-up model 7 years ago. So you've had some foresight. Can you tell the audience here, after presenting on Jam, why it uniquely stands out as a breakthrough that's additive to the greater blockchain ecosystem and may fit into that collection?
Sure. Where to start? Jam is basically a less opinionated version of Polkadot. And that's its sort of chief contribution. It's like, when we did Polkadot, it was very much, like I had this idea in my mind, oh, it should be like sharded Ethereum. Like, except we'll have heterogeneous shards, so different shards can be better at different things. But like the idea was that it had these, that it was made up of many chains, right? Scalable, heterogeneous, multi-chain was how it was originally described. And that's changed. Like my mind has now changed. Like, that's fine. And I wouldn't like, you know, get particularly upset that that's where my brain went at the time, because it was, as you say, it's a long time ago. But Jam gets rid of this multi-chain requirement. It doesn't. It's not that it prevents there being multiple chains. It's just that it's not a need. It's an opinion. It's an opinion over how computation should be organized, and it's not needed. It's perfectly reasonable to have a base layer that doesn't dictate that computation should be split between what I've called in the grey paper persistent fragmentation of state. Right? And this persistent fragmentation of state is problematic, and Jam gets rid of that.
Got it. So, Vitalik, your question is more on implementation side. Gav's was more on the idea side. This will kind of be the theme as I bounce back and forth between these two subjects.
Well, I thought I was the ideas guy, and Gav does all the real coding.
That is... Thanks for both of your service, by the way. One of Ethereum's greatest successes since then has been reaching escape velocity in terms of things like this and larger ecosystem. You have called yourself a glorified blogger, but thankfully you now have people standing by to build on all of the ideas that you can put out there along with thousands of their own. Generally speaking, what do you see as the secret sauce to fostering ecosystem growth?
I think, I was thinking about this recently, actually, in the context of a different discussion. The discussion was basically thinking about like what kinds of narratives Ethereum has versus, like, say, like narratives that like Bitcoin has, or narratives that like Solana has, or narratives that Cardano has, or whatever. And like, there's a improve the world narrative, and there's like a selfish narrative. And I think, obviously, I feel like the kind of improve the world narratives of both Bitcoin and Ethereum are kind of pretty well understood. But then if you think about the selfish narrative, right, like the one for Bitcoin is kind of not pretty easy to see. If you go to like even like Paralelny Polis and just like look at like some of the slogans there. If you go to like any Bitcoin heavy community, it's basically that if the paradigm of the economy is changing, and if you get in earlier, then and you kind of stick it through, and you have diamond hands, then you're going to get wealthier, right? And the Ethereum community doesn't really emphasize this as much, and so one of the things I was wondering, or thinking about, is basically like, what is the selfish narrative of Ethereum? And the best answer that I could come up with, especially for early Ethereum, is basically that Ethereum is like the intellectual ecosystem where the like some of the smartest and most interesting people are, right? And I think that like really was the thing that drove a lot of people, especially kind of early on, right? Especially like people who came in and then started deciding, like, hey, like let's build prediction markets on top of this, let's build DAOs on top of this, let's like research economics and so forth, right? That like there was a community that like actually had this kind of really strong intellectual hub to it, and that was like really key in bringing in a lot of developers, a lot of thinkers, a lot of many different kinds of people. And I think there's like this interesting open question, right, which is like in the 2020s, I think the crypto space is moving from theory to practice, and if you're just working on the theory, then in some sense intellectuals are all you need, but once you're working on practice, and like we have to really reach out to like users and create real applications on a much larger scale, then like how does the Ethereum community need to adapt to that? And like some of the posts I recently wrote on Layer 2 is kind of one of my attempts at an answer. So I think, my answer for how to build an ecosystem, I think it kind of mixes community and tech, because I think community and like both in the sense of like specific people and in the sense of like the specific values that were emphasized especially early on, were super key. But at the same time, there's like the role of technology in enabling community, right? Because if your technology only supports doing things in one specific way, then you often end up gathering a community of people that have an extremely strong motivation to like retroactively convince themselves that the one way that they're already restricted into doing is like actually the only correct way to do everything, right? And like the fact that Ethereum was this general purpose developer platform early on really helped it to avoid the trap. And I think the question now is like, like what is the equivalent of like those things, kind of the right, community choices and the right technology choices for this decade.
So I did read your paper on subcultures. Relatedly, so this is a question to both of you guys. I've said for a long time, just as a participant in these ecosystems, that it looks like one thing that helps is that conflict breeds community. I enjoy this. If you consider some of the outcomes of our industry's most famous conflicts, whether, Gethin parity in multi-client ecosystems, whether it's Jay and Ethan in the Cosmos space, Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, the 2x movement and SegWit, people tend to get involved in something when they have something to fight for. So this is my subjective opinion. I'm wondering if both of you in different contexts maybe would agree with the premise that conflict breeds community, and how blockchain ecosystems can either welcome or foster debate without creating either reliance with too little of it or chaos with too much of it.
I would really hope that it's not the case, but your examples are reasonably pursuant. Yeah, I mean, should this therefore imply we should breed conflict in order to create community?
But isn't that why we're doing layer 2s and why you were doing the parachains thing and now the rollups thing?
I mean, parachain, like the rollups thing are parachains, right? It's the same underlying tech. It's just with less opinionation. I think that Ethereum's strength came from a lack of internal strife. And I think that the community of Ethereum grew large and strong in part because it didn't position itself, like kind of what you were saying, it didn't position itself with too much opinionation. And I think in order to have conflict, there have to be differing opinions. Mm-hmm. And if that leads to a fork in the road, like ETH Classic, for example, then that is going to, I would have thought the most permissive, sensible, moderate part of the fork will probably have a chance at growing the bigger community, and in that particular instance it did. So I'm not sure I'd agree that conflict breeds community. I think if anything, sensible, moderate governance breeds good community and lack of opinionation.
I'll give Vitalik a chance to speak, but just to elaborate, the question wasn't directed at, let's say, inter-layer 1 play. But even within an ecosystem, if we've seen that if one entity is building the official wallet, there may be fewer wallets. If there's one favored DeFi application or chain, there may be fewer other DeFi applications and chains. Whereas even from the beginning of Ethereum's days, when it was Augur versus Gnosis, it was my Ether wallet versus my crypto and these kinds of things, the participating in the discussions and which side is favored, always having more than one option, whether that's necessary, in general. The chain remaining neutral, though, it's well taken.
I think there has to be a good environment for competition. Competition, for sure, helps move stuff forward. At a certain cost, more work is done than strictly necessary. There can be conflict.
I thought the 7702 situation was like one of the better examples of a conflict, like actually creating the motivation to kind of think hard about like what is the synthesis between two sides, and like actually creating something that does a better job of making both sides happy. So there have been things like that. Blobs, as I mentioned from my post this morning, right? Like being able to increase the average block size without increasing the maximum, and so you get more throughput without getting more security risks in a certain sense. So there are sometimes like the existence of a conflict does like create that kind of incentive and like that pressure to really get off your butt and kind of overclock your brain and really like think about what the clever ideas are. So that that definitely is conflict at its best, and I think there's an interesting question in like how do we get more of that, and how do we get like less of like people just yelling at each other.
So similarly, this having been directed as sort of within an ecosystem rather than between them, I had a question about the interplay between layer 1 blockchains, because. So, Gav, you had written an article in 2020 called "Hold Tight, Here Come the Blockchain Wars," and what was interesting is rather than, so personally, what I viewed at the time is that a bunch of great ideas would kind of go head to head, and better elements of better ideas would sort of emerge. But in today's blockchain space, there's probably too much focus on never-ending high fully diluted valuation, low float tokens that are receiving a lot of promotion from elsewhere. And you've both spoken at length about the importance of decentralization in the process. So maybe this isn't the type of war of legitimate versus maybe, pushed that you expected. So trying to refocus the conversation to technologists, on the interplay between L1s, do you see technologies that are different but similar, like Ethereum, Polkadot, or whatever Jam becomes or chooses to become, however it plays out from the people putting it together, as necessarily complementary, whether they're service providers to one another or some other use case, as zero-sum or competitive, or do we not know about the interplay yet based on the utility that results from them?
I think I can't imagine a world where there is only one path to achieving some particular goal, or at least if there, if in the end there is some optimum design, and I really cannot see that. It's really impossible, even for someone of such global intellect, to understand what that design would be up front. So I definitely see it being very important to have many different approaches, and to foster different approaches, providing the costs are not too high. I think, at least, between Ethereum and Polkadot, there are a lot of good. I think the underlying narrative and the desire for continued work are often shared. The values, essentially. I think, again, to take Ethereum and Polkadot as an example, the path selected, they are different. Polkadot certainly in the past has had quite a, I would say, a more opinionated path, not one that I recognized particularly well at the time, but I think with having written and thought about it a lot and written the grey paper, I'm like, it's clearer to see. But I think unfortunately most of the L1 competition that we see is not between approaches with the same underlying values, but actually different values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time the competition between the like projects that have different values, like it ends up being like maximally acrimonious on social media, but then at the same time actually like minimally competitive in practice. Because like if you think about like like say Bitcoin versus Ethereum, for example, right? Like who here would be happy if Bitcoin is the only chain that exists? Okay, so like one, and then imagine if we go to a bit, a Bitcoin like maximalist room with like, like not Bitcoiners, but like the laser eye people, and we ask them like, how many people here would be happy if Ethereum was the only chain in the room? Like we probably have, like also one troll somewhere in the back of the audience raise their hand, right? So that's thank you, troll. Like you bring light and joy to the room. So like, in a lot of ways, like the fact that they have different values actually means that they like are going for different markets. That actually makes them less competitive in a certain sense. Whereas if you have projects that try to have like very similar values, then they end up being more competitive. And I think that this also motivated, like for example, one of my like recent kind of change in thinking toward being more willing to explore Ethereum layer 2s, specializing more in somewhat different directions.
Okay, I have just one more question on things that touch on differences between technologies before getting to things that are more focused on growing a bigger tent. But it's been a while since we used to debate things like on-chain, off-chain governance systems, token voting versus Ethereum-style consensus seeking. I was curious to chat about how you both feel that with some time now in between, there have been some successes and some things that have proven more difficult in both models, whether it's short-term thinking that can come with public voting or excessive public disputes through consensus seeking. There have been speed bumps in any approach. But do you feel confident in the respective paths that these types of systems have taken? Do you think that they might ever change? For example, could Dot's approach change with Jam? Or we've seen some L2s choose, most L2s I think, token voting models while L1 remains off-chain. And do you see these choices as binary, or could there be some interplay there?
Well, I know that we had a chat last time we chatted in Singapore. The idea of on-chain governance upgradability came up, and then we definitely had different opinions on the place of on-chain governance with regards to base layer tech. I'm a little, I would say I'm still pretty keen on on-chain governance, on DAOification. I would say I'm probably quite very keen. I mean, I don't have time these days much to take a thermometer to the broad opinions, but I mean, for me, it's like it's crucial that decentralization happens in terms of social governance as much as it happens in terms of, you know, how many validators there are in the network. But for specifically base layer technology and whether governance or the governance mechanisms for evolving that, how it should evolve, what social consensus is needed, I'm still of the belief that we probably need some clear rules as to how to govern the overall evolution, but I think it's, I'm less of the opinion that the actual base layer technology need be autonomously upgradable. So in that, I think maybe I've come a little bit closer to Vitalik's opinion. But it's more because I believe the base layer technology should probably be kept as minimal as possible, as opinionless as possible, and therefore need not be upgraded, need not be a target for upgrade or evolution on a very, at least, you know, beyond a very long-term timeline.
I think Ethereum has, in general, done well with its off-chain approach to governance, but I actually am interested in the idea of adding a little bit of kind of elements of like formalized I guess DAO style governance, in the sense of like not like literally like having direct on-chain hooks that say if 75% of the decentralized Senate vote, then like the like some like precompile gets added, or like some hard fork happens, but in the sense of having better public signaling tools, right? Basically, like who here remembers Carbon Vote back in like 2016 and 17, right? This was back when we were doing first the DAO fork, and then we were doing the like 3 rounds of issuance reduction and some other things, and there were like a series of votes where if you were an ETH holder, you could vote on whether or not like one of these like very controversial changes that the core devs did not want to like personally be deciders of could happen, and like they were advisory votes, and there was like no commitments by anyone to follow the results. Though in practice, I think they all ended up followed. But I think in 2024, right, what we have is we have not just coin voting, but we also have like all of these different zkID technologies. I mean, we have proof of personhood, we have ZooPass, we have like various proofs of participation. There's all kinds of like different ways of measuring community, and just like having polls that try to use those metrics be available, and like especially for changes that are not kind of technical in the sense of like, oh, do we do Verkle trees, or do we skip straight to starking binary trees with Vision Mark 32, but more like values-driven questions, potentially around economics, potentially around like degree of ossification versus like progress and similar things. Like just having those polls be made, and like just having the results of that be available, I think could steer things in a more democratic direction, instead of like just having this kind of nebulous consensus between a few dozen devs. So I think like I'd be interested in kind of exploring ideas like that and seeing what happens.
So you're saying if anybody has a futarchic system with reputation-based weighting in the audience, to plot away. It's interesting that you guys have both moderated views in that section over time. I think, I'm obviously, I've been a fan of both of your work for a long time. I tend to think that even if our smartest researchers are 98% correct with consistency, a rocket might still explode when it's 2% off course. So it's the collaboration of the technically minded in the industry is something that I don't think that we should give up on at any point. We should keep on-ramping as many gigabrains as possible. So the next question is about growing a bigger tent. How do you encourage new growth in terms of leadership, mentorship, or just generally letting people take the reins on things where you once had greater involvement in order to shrink your portion of the pie, but grow the pie, grow the tent?
I mean, in my case, writing a formal spec is a really helpful way of doing that, rather than being the one coder that knows how this bit of the protocol works. And decentralizing the expertise base with a effective, resilient model for ensuring that other people are well incentivized to take up that expertise base. And I mean, this is what it comes down to. I mean, Ethereum has it relatively easily just due to the number of developers within the ecosystem and the relatively small amount of core protocol with a relatively long period of time that it's been around. Polkadot had a much bigger core protocol. It was really the reference for it was code, which is like, I'm still very much like, when you were like, right, we're going to write a spec and we're going to have 3 different implementations and none of them will be the primary implementation. This was like, yes, this is the way you do it. This is how, in aerospace industry, this is how they make systems so that planes don't fall out of the sky because some guy made a coding error, right? It's totally the right way of doing it, and it's one of the things I was mentioning earlier in the talk. It's like really something that I want to get back to with Jam. It's like there should be a protocol that is written that cannot be a primary implementation, and all other implementations are equal, and they must be based on this reference. But keeping that expertise around is a non-trivial thing, and unless it's kept around, then guess who is the resident expert that must have their phone on 24/7, right? So it's really, I think, important to mechanize this through regular, crypto economic incentive. Like, this is the entire industry, guys. Like, we create incentive structures. We need to create an incentive structure to ensure that expertise is decentralized, not just validator sets.
Mm-hmm. I think over the last 5 to 8 years, Ethereum has done a lot in broadening and decentralizing its developer base, right? So we've gone from about 2 runnable clients and 1 Python client that was too slow for the real chain. I think, did anyone ever manage to sync Ethereum to past the Shanghai DOS days? I'm actually not sure. Syncing past the Shanghai DOS days is hard.
Didn't we base the gas limits partly on the Python node?
Yeah, we did. Then we definitely had a long period of time when Geth was super dominant, but now it feels like there is actually this pretty wide diversity of different client teams, and then you have engineers from teams like Ref that are actively suggesting protocol changes, and then similar things on the consensus side. On the research side, it feels like it's definitely decentralized quite a bit from myself. There's entire changes that make it through the idea generation to spec to EIP to implementation pipeline without myself even really touching them at all. But it's still pretty concentrated in the EF, and trying to see can we broaden that more as one next step. One layer that I feel like we haven't done nearly enough on broadening is what I might call kind of the intellectual and idea layer, like the part of the public discourse that like asks the big picture questions of like, given where the world is in the 2020s, what is Ethereum trying to do? What is the role that Ethereum is trying to have? What is the world that we're trying to achieve through Ethereum existing as opposed to not existing? And like that's the sort of thing where it feels like there's still, like relatively speaking, a much smaller group of people who are participating. There's definitely like new people who are joining, and it does feel like it's getting wider. But like, if I could accelerate one thing, I would definitely try to accelerate that much more.
Okay. As a quick follow-up, on missionaries and mercenaries, Gav mentioned this industry is entirely based on incentive. Anything that can be tried will be tried, and we've seen that play out over time. At which point, do you think that the incentives are, trying to think of a good way to frame it, is it difficult to keep good mind share in those research camps, or are the incentives oftentimes too warped to pull every new idea into a new space that pull them out of both of yours? And how do you maintain that balance so that people can have a bit of they're in the camp, but they don't feel the incentive pull to go elsewhere? I'll go to Vitalik first this time, just because I've been tossing all the questions in the same circular order, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely are important projects that are like really valuable for the ecosystem, and that default incentives that exist automatically don't do a good job of encouraging. And I feel like we have gotten somewhat better at, I would say, covering the early stage of that pipeline, right? So like, the Ethereum Foundation's salaries have increased by quite a significant amount over the last few years. There's more grant programs. A lot of them are very independent for the foundation. There's Gitcoin grants. There's Optimism RPGF. There is Protocol Guild. But one of the ways in which that's like still really incomplete is that I think often like there's this pattern where in order to build a thing, there's like a stage one of the thing, which is basically a demo that where you can write the core code in a hackathon and then like finish it and do all of the security auditing in a few months and like maybe spend $100,000. And then there's a second stage, which is like you get it from demo stage to a stage where it's like actually able to compete at world scale. And that second stage maybe costs like $100 million. And it feels like a lot of the time what projects have to deal with is like, while they're doing the first stage, they're in this like very, like happy, like friendly communist bubble. And, you have like these, they don't have to worry about money. They can ask like one of 10 different groups of nice guys to provide the funding, and the funding comes and lots of people are willing to help. But then as soon as they grow past that first stage, like the incentives suddenly shift, and suddenly like you have to basically rely entirely on things like tokens and VCs. And so like it feels like there is this kind of chasm in between this kind of early stage and these like very like much later stage like successful ideas and projects that we're still not doing a good enough job of handling. And I think trying to figure out how to improve on that is like one of those puzzles that I really care about.
Yeah. I mean, making sure everyone gets what they think that they should get is really hard, especially when we're talking about innovations that could have huge effects and huge value. But no one really knows what that huge value would be until it's actually fully deployed, and then, and this is, might not make very many friends here, but like this is one of the reasons communism doesn't work, right? I mean, it's like there can be no sort of central board that apportions particular resources to particular people on the basis of what their innovation may or may not bring. This is why market-based systems actually do a much better job. They let the market decide, and in principle, the market should apportion resources according to the value of the thing. So presumably some market-based incentive structure that exists within an ecosystem would be an obvious way forward. I think probably the biggest thing is just to sort of have the incentive so that it's people have what they need to experiment and are well. Don't somehow, if they want to take it further, and I totally get this whole thing of like there being sort of an early stage and a later stage. In the early stage, it is about having what you need to experiment, or it should be. Some people, you know, grifters are like, no, give me 10 million now and I'll maybe think about coding something up. It's like, no, well, maybe they're not the people that we should be talking about. But in the later stage, yeah, sure, you know, if one wants to have significant value capture, it's probably not going to be given with a 100K grant. You're probably going to have to set up some value capture mechanism. And I suppose in that case, it's about having a sufficiently permissive ecosystem structure that that value capture is available to some degree at least, to an acceptable degree, without them having to leave the ecosystem altogether.
I have one easy mode question to wrap, and then the boss is going to let me know if there's time for an audience question or two, or if we're over. But so for all of the builders out here, or that were at ETH Berlin last week, at any event in this industry where they're building things, making a difference, if they might someday be the Gavs or the Vitaliks in their own worlds, who are some people in the open source community generally that you admire in terms of their own leadership, or qualities that you've looked to emulate when championing your own ideas that you would urge that they learn from? To whoever has a name or two that pops into their head first this time, because when you're put on the spot, you know.
It's a hard one.
I called it an easy mode question, but I may have lied.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, you know, if I'm going to be put on the spot to pick a name, an open source guy out of the air, I mean, Linus Torvalds has done his...
But that was the name in my head.
Sorry. I mean, is maybe the obvious one, right? And he generally, you know, says sensible stuff, and he's not afraid to say stuff. I think these are two very important qualities to have.
If you both agree, it makes it easier to get him to the next ETH Prague. Anything further, Vitalik, or should I toss to the audience?
Toss to the audience.
All right. Franzi, how many do we have time for? Okay, 1 to 2. So. All right.
Yeah, okay, so audience questions, raise your hands. And since we only have time for 1 to 2, please really think about a good one.
So hello everyone. I would be curious to hear your opinion. Like both of you were kind of like in the epicenter of the whole industry for more than a decade. There was tens of billions of dollars invested from private capital, also a lot of money from the retail capital, and also you could see Bitcoiners paying for coffee nearby in Paralelnipolis. It's cute, but why do you think the industry, despite all that capital of intelligence, social capital, and financial capital, is still so irrelevant? Like the amount of daily active users is like less than 1% of population of the entire world. I fear that's even like 0.1% of the entire population. Why do you think it's still a case despite so much of concentrated effort and intellectual and social and financial capital?
For me, it's about this is sadly still mostly a technical and financial product that is trying to be marketed to people that have basically zero technical and financial needs and background. when we start, when it becomes predominantly about a product that is relevant to the average person, then there will be an according market uptake. But you know, this was born of Bitcoin, right? And Bitcoin is a technical financial product, right? It's highly technical, and it's based almost exclusively around the finance, and it's just not relevant for most people. For some people who really understand the technical elements, the social context of it, and need to buy a cup of coffee or send money from one place in the world to another, then yeah, it may become more relevant. But in general, it's just not relevant.
I think there is a sense in which the kind of natural target market of this technology is just inherently the entire set of the world's non-average people, in the sense that you know, if there is some workflow that like really massive numbers of people around the world do, then like even centralized infrastructure is going to be built around it and is going to make it crazy convenient, right? And you know, people are going to build apps around it. People are going to you know, like build the regulatory frameworks to accommodate it. People are going to you know, like integrate it all into you know, the banks and like all of the existing mainstream stuff. And a lot of the existing like pragmatic use cases of crypto have you know, precisely been the ones that like target people that are target people and target situations that are not well targeted by a lot of these existing institutions, right? So international payments is like probably the one where I personally get the largest amount of use value. And then if you see where people get the largest like pragmatic use value from crypto in general, a lot of it is just like people in developing countries, right? And because you know, that is the place where like the banks are just not interested in like extending current centralized systems, right? And you know, like people who go toward decentralized approaches like this, even outside of blockchains, I mean, like often are people where there's like some fundamental barrier that like discourages the you know, like established centralized approaches from serving them, right? And I think that is something that, like to some extent, you know, the space is like it's totally okay to embrace, and it's something that you know, the more we do a good job of embracing it, and at the same time, like actually continue doing things like working on improving the technology and the infrastructure, so we're not like needlessly putting up extra barriers in front of users, the more we can kind of keep finding more of these long tail use cases that are super valuable for people.
So I think I would also point out that your examples are bang on in terms of the developing world, but I think the reason that these systems are actually increasing, you know, more used in the developing world, more useful, is because they're more relevant, and the relevance comes from the resilience that in the developing world, systems like the social structure and many of things based on the social structure, like the financial services, are just not resilient. They're corrupt, right? They don't function well. One of the biggest sort of areas that I see people excited about, geographical areas like Argentina and South America. Why? Well, because you know, the alternative to using crypto is not very good. It's not resilient. And I think there is inevitably a cost to using Web3 technologies, right? It's harder to engineer these things, as we well know. And but the thing that you get for that is resilience, which means it can operate in areas of the world where maybe people are where structures and organizations are function less well, where there is just an underlying higher noise and corruption factor.
Okay, that question hit a spot, apparently. We unfortunately have to wrap here. The program will commence. Again, a huge thank you to Gavin, Vitalik, Joe for doing this. It was very special. change the stage setup and be back in 2 minutes.